Namaste. Last time we spoke about yoga, which is a very important aspect of Sanatana Dharma, and it implies that man can become one with God, which is something very different from what we hear in religious doctrines. In religious doctrines, there is separation between man and God. They are connected either with a thread of worship or belief. But in Sanatana Dharma, through yoga, it is possible for man to become one with God. So, does it discard the religious approach? No. That is the beauty of Sanatana Dharma. It understands that there is a whole hierarchy of approach toward the eternal, and it sees even denial of God as a step towards the journey. That is something very beautiful. See, one of the suktas of the Rig Veda's 10th mandala, where the story of creation is described. Very often people quote it because the seer describes about the gods, it describes about the cosmic waters. But the last mystery, it says, perhaps he knows about the creation or maybe he does not. Now, it is because the mind has reached its ultimate limit of thought. So, this, of course, the seer of the Rig Veda he's reached a very, very high layer of truth where you can't call about it as anything. It's nothing, it's everything. No human mental definition can really capture that truth. But much earlier also, there is a stage in the human development when we deny God. Now, there is a whole atheistic philosophy which very often people who say that, Sanatana Dharma includes everything. They particularly take up this Nastikvad, which is basically that denial of the existence. Nasti, there is no supreme existence. Actually, in a way, you cannot deny because existence is a reality. You may say that there is no supreme existence, but there is something called as existence, that is for sure. But essentially, it's a denial of God. And based on that denial, there is a whole philosophy of living, which we know is Charvak Siddhant, where, Charvak is not one human being, but a way of life that, don't think about other world. Think about this moment. And you have to live this moment. And he validates many things which are traditionally invalid. Now, why is this included? It's a great enigma otherwise. Now, it is included because denial is the first step. See, if we look at it this way, what do we deny? We deny something we secretly affirm. It's a great truth of our psychology. When somebody is vehemently trying to oppose something, either within oneself or in the world existence, that means psychologically he is carrying it inside. Take for a very practical thing, when somebody has an opinion about you. Now, if it is not true, you don't bother about it, you just laugh at it. Isn't it? You feel amused about it. But if you feel there is some truth in it, you feel the need to vehemently oppose it and deny it. Because secretly we affirm it. So, denial of God is the first step when the mind gropes. Because from ignorance, it has to journey towards the light, supreme light. It cannot suddenly, it will be blinded. That's why in Sanatana Dharma, everything, it's a whole hierarchy of beings. From the journey starts from the totally Rakshasic nature, which is completely submerged in darkness. And if you ask who is God for a Rakshasa, he will say that whoever can provide me food is God. Because it is his appetite that he sees the whole universe as a means for his enjoyment and appetite. So he puts himself as if in front of God. The whole universe is meant for the enjoyment of the Lord. But he says, I am the one who must enjoy all these things. So it starts from utter denial. Then there is a groping. The thought begins to wake up a little bit and says, okay, let me find out, is there a truth or reality behind this universe? And we have several conceptions of God. Next step. So in these conceptions, there are various philosophies. Each of these philosophies takes a certain angle of vision. Let's take the three important philosophies, which there are many others, but three important ones which come in the realm of Vedanta. So we know these three are, one is pure Advaita. Now Advaita denies an individual existence or only says that it is there but only as a temporary thing. It's transient. There is nothing eternal about it. And the analogy is like the waves in an ocean. So we as individuals, which we say we are individuals, want to affirm our individuality, there is no reality behind it. According to one school of thought, it's not the ultimate. So It is as real as a wave, as ephemeral as a wave. Real, ephemeral, transient, momentarily real. Next moment it will lapse. So waves, truth is basically the ocean. It is not the ocean, but it is of the ocean. There is a difference between the two. Wave is not the ocean, but it is of the ocean, and into ocean it will lapse and finish. So from that comes the yoga, Vedantic yoga, pure Vedantic yoga, Advaitic monism, where we want to discover that which is beyond all names and forms. That's why Buddhist yoga has been included in the Indian yogic system, because Buddha does precisely that. He uses the word permanent. The monastic Advaitin uses the word Ekamev Dvityam, the one. It doesn't matter, but behind all appearances there is a truth, and that's all. We have to find reality, and then all the appearances vanish. Now this causes many philosophical problems, because if that were so, by one person's awakening everything else should dissolve, because there is no real individuality, and there are many other issues about it. Who really becomes free in that case? Because this wave will anyways lapse. So all effort at yoga becomes superfluous, because this wave can't help but lapse back into the ocean. So there is another school of thought. Another school of thought is there is an eternal reality of the creator and the individual, of the divine and the creation, and both are together, and they remain, though they are together, they remain distinct and unique. So you have this, the best analogy that comes is light. Now light has number of aspects: heat and light. It is both together. Or we can say it is light and it has vibrations through which this light actually spreads all around. That's how light spreads, because it has vibration. Now, is vibrations that emerge from the light separate from light? No, it is one with the light. So this school says they are one and yet they are separate. So, we have the doctrine of Visishtadvaita or Bheda Bhed, where there are one and yet they are distinct, separate. The vibrations of light are distinct. At the same time, their existence is only because of the light. They are together. Or we can equally say that because of this, the light exists. The light is nothing but the vibrations. Then there is still further we go, there is a third school of thought, and there we'll find that many of these religious approaches, that both of them are not only distinct, but they remain forever separate. Though the goal of the separate unit is still to find the origin. But unlike the Visishtadvaita, where they are eternal, they are separate and one at the same time. It's a very subtle distinction. The other is they are separate and distinct. But the goal of this is to become that. Now that analogy is like a river rushing to the sea. Now there is a point where the river becomes the sea. But then, is the river the sea? No, the river is not the sea. River has its own uniqueness, and the sea is its own uniqueness. The river can merge into the sea endlessly. That's what it is happening. But yet the river will remain distinct, separate, and the sea will remain distinct and separate. So this is the third kind of conception. So this is how there are several schools of thought which sprung up when the mind started searching and groping for God in its relation with the Creator. Then when the mind builds up the conceptions, it holds conceptions of God. We'll see in certain religions. So the conception of God can be, we can stress upon one quality or another quality. We may say God is love. We may say God is truth. We may say God is justice. We may say God is compassion, or God is peace. All these, and we can pick up one aspect and build a whole universe and a path around it. Now, the interesting part about this is, and that's where the error lies, when we say God is love, we are thinking He is love in the way we as human beings understand love. And then when the divine shatters this idea of love as we understand a sentimental, emotional something, then we wonder whether God is really love or He is cruel. And we cannot understand the ways of the Lord, because He is all loving, and yet we say that He rides in the car and He strikes in the spear. He is full of compassion. On one side He is full of compassion. That's why people cannot understand Shri Krishna in the Mahabharata. That how come He speaks about all compassion and yet He is destroying. I am Kala, the destroyer. This is my will today to destroy these people. Now, this destruction itself is compassion. Now, compassion and love can destroy is a very interesting conception, because the Indian thought is not Venetian, like good and bad, like this. You see how compassion destroys. Compassion destroys all that is artificial, false. And an intense love, the divine love, will destroy it ruthlessly. And you may feel that, oh, what kind of love? My lover is destroying everything that I held and cherished. But actually, if you see from the lover's point of view, he is liberating us. So that's why Shiva is at once the god of liberation and is also the god of destruction. So you always, when Shiva you associate with that, he is the great liberator, Mokshadai. At the same time, he is the great destroyer. And that's why you see that Shiva's land starts from the Shamashan Bhumi. When you destroy the ego right to the physical level, then Shiva comes into play. He says, okay, now Kala has done his job, now Mahakal will do his job. So we have this, then justice. Again, we have unique human conceptions of justice. Somebody has done this, he should be punished. Karmic law has been misunderstood. Popular notion of karmic law is reward and punishment. What reward? Human reward. So if somebody has done a good deed, he must become a rich person in next life. After all, he must be rewarded for his good deed. Now look at the ignorance. We think having money is very good. So the divine also must reward us with money. But it may be that the divine doesn't value money at all. And he may snatch away all your money simply because you have done good deeds. As in the case of Pandavas. See, look at Pandavas, those who were favorite of Krishna. Whole life they suffered from childhood to their final passage. Born a prince, but born in the forest, though they are prince. They should inherit the kingdom. Then again banished, again they build Indraprastha out of Khandaprastha, again by deceit. 13 years banished. Then they win the kingdom, they cannot enjoy because they are good people. They can't build a kingdom on the dead body corpses of their slain brothers. Then toward the end, they walk into the Himalayas. Nobody knows where they died, when they died. There is no grave, nothing, in their name. On the other hand, Duryodhana, born a prince, lived a prince, died a prince. So, but who are the favorites of Krishna? It is Pandavas. So this human conception of justice, whereas the divine conception of justice is very different. This idea of sin itself is very different. Now, if you look at sin, this in the typical Semitic religions, the idea of sin is that it moves in the mental plane. So there are some arbitrary rules. That's how the Venetian thought comes in. That this is good, this is bad. Isn't it? That's how we look at. And this is all right when we are in the primitive stages of evolution. We need some kind of a yardstick. But dharma is not like that. Dharma is something very subtle. What is good for a Kshatriya may not be good for a Brahmin. May not be good for a Vaishya. What is good for a Vaishya may not be good for a Kshatriya. If Kshatriya leaves his urge to fight and conquer and protect those who are under him and wants to amass money and wealth, it's a degradation of sorts. Similarly, a Brahmin who is meant to lead a life of tyaga and tapasya to gain spiritual knowledge and to impart knowledge of any kind, like Dronacharya. You see, this is the interesting part about Dronacharya. Dronacharya in the Mahabharata is at one level a character who falls from the heights. He is a teacher. And teacher is, look at Parsuram was also there. Parsuram doesn't go into the battlefield and starts engaging in battle. Why? Because he's a teacher. He has taught Karna, Bhishma, Drona. Look at the interesting arrangement in Mahabharata. Opposite Arjuna are these three great heroes, all of them taught by the same great master. There is none like him. Parshurama is the highest, in terms of all kinds of Shastra Vidya. But on the other side, look at how beautifully it goes. All of them have learned from Dronacharya, who is third generation teacher. But on the other side is Krishna, silent, unarmed, sitting on the chariot, would not lift an arm, and yet the victory comes. So dharma is something very different. Dharma is not even about prowess, capacity, but dharma is the unfolding of the truth inside each one. And it will take place differently at different stages for evolution. So the consequences are also different. So what is sin? Sin is deviating from your own dharma. If Arjuna doesn't fight the battle, it is actually a sin. Because it's his dharma to protect the weak, to fight for what is true and noble and right and beautiful. And if he doesn't do it, he will fall from grace. Whereas, in another instance, when Vidur says, Vidur is a Mahatma, he says, I don't fight the battle, he doesn't incur anything. He is following his course. He is a specialist in knowledge of dharma. So, dharma cannot be bracketed into right and wrong. So, there is a whole evolutionary process through which man passes. So, justice also depends on that. Yudhishthir does one mistake because Yudhishthir is a dharmatma. He cannot do this mistake of thinking that wife and kingdom are my property. That's what he thought when he put it at stake. And therefore, 13 years of banishment. Whereas Duryodhana all his life thought like that. But the level of development of Yudhishthir is on a very high scale. He cannot afford to make this mistake. Sri Aurobindo puts it very interestingly. When you're flying your aeroplane high, and then you see when aeroplanes fly very fast and high, then if a bird hits it, it falls to the ground. But if you are going on a scooter and if a bird hits, even if you fall, you will maximum maybe suffer some odd fracture. But if a flight falls, we can understand the risk. So again, dharma has two aspects of it. One is in our evolutionary unfolding at different stages. There is a different need of the soul. So dharma is not a mental thing. Morality is of the mind, whereas dharma is of the soul. This is an important distinction. So dharma belongs to the soul for each one, and we have to discover our own dharma. That is the unique beauty about it. So dharma is not something somebody else can teach us. It is inbuilt within our soul, in our very temperament, tendencies, unique approach to life. Then we evolve. So again, justice is not human justice, but from the highest standpoint, justice means that when we deviate from dharma, then we cut off from the delight of existence. Look at again these two people. On one side is Yudhishthir, who stays with dharma. On the other side is Duryodhana, who is full of adharma. Why adharma? Why it is called adharma? Because he is a Kshatriya. But what he does, he is driven by ambition and egoism, pride, lust, vanity. So what happens to Duryodhana and Karna? All their life they are unhappy creatures. Why? Because they have covered the dharma with things which are distorting it. That's why there is an expression of dharma, and then there are things which cover the dharmas. They are the enemies of the soul. Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Matsar. All these are the enemies of the soul. Fear, they are enemies of the soul. The first thing that Shri Krishna tells Arjuna is, if you are afraid of everything, you can't really fulfill your dharma. So again we see that there is a dharma which is a cry of the soul, need of the soul to evolve in a certain way. When we do that, we are filled with delight. Doesn't matter outside what we have or don't have. And it applies at every level. You know, there is a mother recounts the story of an artist, I think Raphael, who used to paint, and he was, a very poor man. And she recounts the very interesting story that somebody came and he used to paint, and then the palette scrapings, he would put it on a canvas, just like that. They are like waste. And people couldn't appreciate his paintings, but they appreciated that and said, this is modern art, this is very nice. And bought it for a fortune. So, but he was poor, yet he continued to do it. Why? Because it gave him a joy. He was expressing his own true dharma. So, dharma doesn't ensure that you will be rich, but it ensures that you will get what you will get, what you are imagining to get when you become rich. So that is how there is a whole complex evolutionary process. There is a, Rakshasa dharma, Asura dharma, then Deva dharma, human dharma, Pashu dharma, Pati dharma is there, by the way. It's not only that Patni dharma is there. Don't listen. Pati has his own dharma. He is supposed to live by. He is always supposed to, be a guardian. He is supposed to make sure that those who are with him, they are protected. This is how it is. But now, of course, women protect their husband. That is a different story. because now it's a new yuga and new dharma. She has resumed the role of Shakti. So, this is the whole process through which evolution takes place. Then comes the next stage. After all these intellectual philosophies, conceptions, approaches to God, partial glimpses, human conceptions, a time comes when the soul begins to ripen. Earlier, it is the mind through which man is approaching God. Mind is a second-hand thing. He's a manager, not the owner of the house. But through these experiences, mind's stumblings and gropings, readings of philosophy, one day this little prince, the soul within it, begins to awaken. So what happens then? Then faith is born. Now with faith, there is an attraction towards the divine. You start drawing towards the divine. And then a new impulsion takes hold. You are not satisfied with philosophy. As long as one is satisfied with philosophy, one is very far from yoga. Then there is an urge to, like the river going toward the sea, I want to know the divine. I want to become the divine. That's when the paths of yoga open up, of which we spoke. And as we proceed further and further, through these paths, its crowning moment is, imagine a big magnet and an iron, which is a piece of iron, which is, when it is very far, there is an attraction, which you can find out if you measure the forces. But otherwise, you won't see any change. But as it draws near and near and near, there is a critical point. What happens after that point? The iron doesn't do anything. It just rushes and merges with the great magnet. So as we draw near to the divine, the urge to serve and self-giving becomes more and more prominent. Because we are very near. We want to go fast. There is nothing else which matters. In the beginning, this faith takes a very crude form. So what is the crude form of the faith? The Gita speaks of these 4 levels of faith through which, and love through which, it speaks about bhakti, but essentially it's a kind of faith and devotion through which men move toward the divine. First is artharthi and arth, these two. Arth is, we remember the divine only during examination time. It's okay. Divine says fine, elementary stage. Next is when we want the divine, or arth is actually not even that. Arth is when you are in distress, really when you are in, there is a severe pain, one is confronting death, suddenly calls the divine. Divine responds. And the artharthi who is wanting to succeed in examination, after that he forgets the divine, or time to time he remembers, oh, he had helped me, so goes, offers this much money to Tirupati or some place, and he is happy that I have paid my little bit to God. But this is elementary. This is not yet yoga. It is, but faith is leading one towards that. Even this is acceptable. Then comes a time when you want to know the divine, jigyasu. And this jigyasa is not a mental jigyasa, but an urge within, seeking. And then there is the jnani, who knows the divine and yet has bhakti for him, because he knows that me and him, we are one. And he wants more and more to become that complete integer, that what creates fulfillment. So there is the self-giving, and when there is the merger, there is the complete delight of existence. Before that, whatever one may do, nothing to do with karmas. I mean, karma theory we'll talk about some other time. But you cannot get the delight of existence until you have found that wholeness in the divine. That's why we see the Isha Upanishad starts by that. You want delight, so the path is renunciation. Strange. We talk about vairagya. Most, again, very ill understood term in Indian thought. Because by vairagya, we means physically abandoning the object. But vairagya is not about that. Vairagya is abandoning the object from the heart and the sensory mind. You see, modern psychology understands it. You abandon physically. There are a lot of people who try this. Ascetics try it. People in certain yoga ashramas try it. Outwardly, they abandon. But inwardly, the mind is taking rasa. The senses are still enjoying it. The heart is still enjoying it. And if that is the case, this abandonment doesn't lead to delight. It is just what is called as mithyachar. It's very strange. The whole vision changes. Shri Krishna tells Arjuna, you are indulging in mithyachar. Why you are indulging in mithyachar? Because you are saying that I want to take sannyasa. But in your heart, you are inflamed. You want to fight the battle. And if you abandon the arms, you will end up, because this is your dharma, you are a Kshatriya. So this is what a complex and beautiful and complete and whole the Sanatana Dharma is. Sometimes it creates difficulty that Well, a lot of people don't understand it. Often people nowadays, this debate goes on that there are so few Hindus in the world, which is also true. And it's partly because it's very complex. It's true. But then, if you look at it from another standpoint, you go to kindergarten, how many students are there? Hundreds of students, isn't it? How many end up with PhD? Hinduism is like PhD. If you are satisfied with just a very simple doctrine, no, tell me good or bad, right or wrong. Someone has asked, why is Krishna talking endlessly to Arjuna? Arjuna is asking a very simple question that, should I fight or not fight? But no, in Hindu thought, it's not like that. That's why there is not one book, not one scripture, not one God. So it is not meant for the unchaste. I put it like this, that the unchaste, unripe mind is not yet ready for the vastness and profundity and the depth that Hinduism can bring to the world. So always there will be few Hindus. But these are the apex. And because of, I'm talking of the true Hindus, not about the population count. Because they are there, the world remains stable on its axis. Precisely because there are few. Because you don't need many persons. There is one person who sitting in his laboratory discovers that, you can tap light from the sun. Many take advantage of it. So Hindu is like that. That's why in Hinduism there is no idea of conversion. Because you cannot. If you try it also to convert somebody to Hindu thought, if it's premature, the person will either reduce it to a dogma, that Hinduism means don't kill a cow, don't do this, that. It will be a vegetarian without understanding the truth behind all these things. Or visit the temple daily, do Ekadashi Vrat, Shani Bhagwan Puja. This is like reduce a small mind when it catches something very vast. It reduces it to such inanities. It again turns it into one of these Semitic religions. But Hinduism admits it. Even as it admits all other approaches, it says, okay, this is the preliminary approach to the divine. But for that, you don't have to say that one has to get converted. But the true Hinduism, so there are two kinds of Hinduism, as Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo said, and Swami Vivekananda used a very interesting word. He said, kitchen spirituality. Who is a Hindu? Who is a vegetarian? Does not drink alcohol, does not smoke, does 5 times Sandhya Vandan. It's almost like a namazi. So, you see that, he does all these things, and we may add Ekadasi Vrat and this Vrat and that Vrat, Dan Punya, and he is a Hindu. This is a kitchen spirituality. It has nothing really to do with the core of Hinduism. It is there, accepted as a preliminary stumbling thing. But ultimately, what is the core of Sanatan Dharma? That by which the dharma, by which the way of life, by which you evolve and become one with the eternal. That is the ultimate reality, that we are portions of the eternal and therefore eternal. And we have no business to be limited beings. We are infinite. Why are we playing at being bound and finite? Why are we playing at being limited and little? So Sanatan Dharma, when these thoughts, that's why Shri Krishna starts on a very high note. When he tells Arjuna, what kind of thoughts are coming to you? You are afraid? You are shivering? This is an Aryan thought. An Aryan never feels like that. For an Aryan, life is limitless, boundless, infinite, eternal, because that is the path of the Sanatan Dharma. So this is the little background, and we read a passage from Sri Aurobindo, and specifically about the renunciation part. How we grow through renunciation. Because when we renounce, what do we end up renouncing? We renounce our limits. This is the beautiful thing. When we renounce our limits, that I will get enjoyment only through this or through that, the whole world enjoyment rushes towards us. But we don't know this secret. We don't even believe it. And this is what we are here to learn. So we read this passage again from the Ishavasya Upanishad. And Sri Aurobindo gives us very practical examples. This is page 106 for those who want to go back and read it. It tells us, the Isha Upanishad, by abandonment of this, all that is in the world, to enjoy and not covet any man's wealth. We are to enjoy the whole world, but not to covet the possession of others. Tena tyaktena bhunjita magridaya kasya sviddhanam. See how the words in Sanskrit, the word gridha. Heard about this word? Who is gridha? Also the bird which gidh. What does it covet? Even a dead person's body it wants to covet. Most animals will not eat you even if they think you are dead. They will eat. They must kill and then they eat. And there is a reason behind it. They make an effort. Have you seen how animals chase one another? Why do they chase? They chase because when the other prey is running, it's because of the blood supply, it flows and swells and it's like a cooked meat. But the gidh doesn't, it wants to just covet. It's sitting there, waiting for somebody to kill and therefore it covets. So this is called effortless enjoyment. Wanting to do that, and that's why it's regarded as something as low as, and the same word, look at it, gridha. Gridha, the word itself is so like you are going and forcibly possessing something. The sound itself will give you a feeling what the word is about. So ma gridha kasya sviddhanam. So it says that if you want not to covet the possession of others, it will bring unhappiness invariably. How is this possible? If I, Devadatta, am told to enjoy all that is in the world, but find that I have very little to enjoy while my neighbor Harishchandra has untold riches, how can I fail to envy him his wealth, and why should I not try to get it for my own enjoyment? You see, now describing the principle, why lobha is dangerous and harmful. If I safely can, so Sri Aurobindo is putting this clause, why not, if I can do it without any problems and hassles? I shall not try because I cannot, because I have realized that there is nothing in this world but Brahman manifesting the universe by his Shakti, and that there is no Devadatta, no Harishchandra, but only Brahman in various states of consciousness to which these names are given. If therefore Harishchandra enjoys his riches, then it is I who am enjoying them. This is the state in which the yogin rises. Now one is envy, jealousy, ambition, fear. The other is expansion, wideness, delight. Even if we can be happy in others' happiness, we have taken a great step. And why this comes? Because we are becoming wide. We have understood this secret. That today the wealth or position is with someone, tomorrow it will pass away. It will not, it's not going to stay with one person. Purush Pura, somebody has said very interestingly about Goddess Lakshmi. Not Goddess Lakshmi in her original splendor, but regarding wealth. That Purush Puratan ki vadhu, kyun na chanchala hoye? That Vishnu Bhagwan is an old man and she is such a beautiful maiden. So she cannot stay with an old man. She will be chanchala. Now, wealth is like that. It is moving from one source to another. It is, look at how they could combine psychological truth with some very profound mystic truth. Now, this is the way it must flow. But when I want to possess it, position, power, wealth, name, fame, I am going to be unhappy at some point of time. When people are very attached to the name, they get very hurt when somebody insults them. Why? Because, my name is important. So, nothing. It may come and go, but not to be attached to it. Not my body in which I am imprisoned, or my desires by which my body is made miserable, but my true self, the Purusha within me, who is the witness and enjoyer of all this sweet, bitter, tender, grand, beautiful, terrible, pleasant, horrible, and wholly wonderful and enjoyable drama of the world, which Prakriti enacts for his delectation. Look at it. You watch a movie, whole movie, with all the shades of experiences, you enjoy it. But when that movie is being played in your own life, then you are unhappy. Why is it so? Because it is somebody else. You have become a witness. So, too, if we become a witness and we regard that all this is a drama that Prakriti is playing For the enjoyment of the Lord, you are by the way there. When a director has made the movie, it's for his own joy. Swanta Sukhai. But you can watch it, share the joy. Vyasa did not write the Mahabharata thinking that one Mr. Alok Pandey or Amit or somebody XYZ will read it. He wrote the Mahabharata, he enjoyed it, he was felt fulfilled. Now any number of people can read it, interpret it, enjoy it in their own way. But Vyasa's job is done. So this is how we should be in this world. Being in the world, but not of the world. Something in us should always remain separate. And then, Sri Aurobindo puts it in one of his aphorisms that if Radha loves Krishna, why would I not love even Chandrabali? Because why? Because Chandrabali is one of the friends of Radha, whom Krishna loves. So why should I have jealousy? Now you see this jealousy. Last time we spoke about Anusuya. Jealousy, possessiveness, all lust, greed, will to have more, they come from ignorance. But in truth, you discover it's neither yours nor excess. It is belongs to the Lord. To one, neither to A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z. Okay? So, to the one. And he uses these various forms. Now, if as the Sankhyas and other philosophies and the Christians and other religions declare, there are innumerable Purushas and not one, there would be no ground for the Christian injunction to love others as oneself, or for the description by the Shruti and Smriti of the perfect sage as Sarva Bhuta Hita Rata, busied with and delighting in the good of all creatures. So that's why the sage who discovers this truth, before discovering this truth, all our efforts are towards satisfying my own desires. When you discover this truth, you are Sarva Bhut Hite Rata. Why? Because they are secretly or even openly they are not others. They are your own self who have extended limitlessly. For then Harishchandra would be in no way connected with me, and there would be no point of contact between us except the material from which hatred and envy are far more ready to arise than love and sympathy. How then could I prefer him to myself? But from the point of view of Vedanta, such preference is natural, right, and in the end inevitable. So the disciple asks, how is this natural, right, inevitable preference of others over oneself? Now Sri Aurobindo reveals. It is natural because I am not really preferring another to myself, but my true self to my false. God, who is in all, to my single body and mind. Myself in Devdatta and Harishchandra, to myself in Devdatta alone. It is right because it is better for me to enjoy the enjoyment of Harishchandra than to enjoy my own, since in this way I shall make my knowledge of Brahman a reality and not a mere intellectual conception or assent. So to make this knowledge into something real and living, we have to start living our life like that. Otherwise it will never become real. We will know it in principle, but still I'll covet my own enjoyment as greater and compared to others. But the day I begin, that's why you see even service to man, service to others. When the mother started the ashram, not ashram, when she just came. So she started this new idea. And the members were required, one, to spend some time in self-reflection. And another thing was 1 hour to be useful to others. Just to be useful. You are not doing something just because you will earn money or you will get something out of it. You are doing it for others. And this itself is a great training. Because when we do it, then after some time, if we do it rightly with the right attitude, we begin to discover. See, that's how when people who are busy helping others, they begin to feel the joy inside. Of course, there are many levels. You can get the subtle ahankar that I am helping others. So all this is there. But at least that is better than only living for oneself and one's own enjoyment. So these are steps of the ascension. Since in this way I shall make my knowledge of Brahman in reality, I shall turn it into an experience, Anubhav. And Anubhav, the Smriti tells us, is the essence of true jnana. So jnana is not an intellectual thing, but experience. It must become a living reality. I think this is where India also fell, because it had a vast body of such wonderful literature. But everything was ultimately either reduced to illusionism or an intellectual discussion. So the yogis began to take a back seat, and more of, intellectual approach, and this and in that intellectual approach all this is illusion, but to make it a living reality, all these are the tools. The world is the tool. The world contact, the blows of the world awaken the knowledge within us. For this reason, perfect love, by which I do not mean the mere sensual impulse of man towards woman, it is a great and enabling thing. Perfect love, which he says is not this. For by its means, two separated conditions of the universal consciousness come together and become one. So that's why love is the original power in creation, which unites creation with the Creator. But in the beginning, it takes this form. And then he brings it to many levels. For by its means, two separated conditions become one. Still nobler and more ennobling is the love of the patriot. So one is the love of a man and a woman. But greater is for a larger unit, love of the patriot who lives and dies for his country. For in this way, he becomes one with millions of divine units. And still greater, nobler, more exalting, the soul of the philanthropist who, without forgetting family or country, lives and dies for mankind or for all creatures. Sarvabhuti Terata. So he's taking us. Very often people say philanthropy or humanitarianism, all these are. Now it is in a certain context that Sri Aurobindo is saying. So many people, you are neither here nor there. These are steps in the ascension. So they say, no, Sri Aurobindo has said philanthropy, altruism, humanitarianism are things of ignorance. You must serve only the divine. Absolutely true. But you can engage in all these activities not with the idea that you are a philanthropist, but with the idea of serving the divine in all creatures. But what very often happens, people, because of this, they don't take this step, and they mechanically begin to believe that I am serving the divine for whatever reasons. Whereas actually they have not even taken the first step to step out of the boundaries of the ego. So in the end you discover that you are still attached to the ego. You are still attached to position, you are still attached to name, fame, everything else, because one has not taken the necessary steps. So, this reminds me of that famous, somebody asked Sri Aurobindo that, I've heard that Swami Vivekananda was prone to anger. Sri Aurobindo says it's a bane of today's times that we tend to bring down the people, the greatness. We have a tendency to bring them down to our level. Because if there is nothing like greatness, then there will be nothing noble for man to walk. And then he says, people think that just because Vivekananda had anger like them, they are half as great as Vivekananda. Vivekananda is Vivekananda. It doesn't matter. Even if there is anger, he is far beyond an average humanity. That is what people don't understand. So, this is called LCM and HCF. LCM is reduced everything to the least common. LCM, am I correct? Least common multiple. HCF, the highest common factor. So LCM is animal nature, outer nature, surface nature. It's the same in all. And we can keep looking at that. But yoga teaches us HCF, highest common factor. What is the highest common factor? The divine. Look at that in everyone, life changes. Look at the LCM in everyone, then life is miserable. Become one with millions of divine units and still greater, the philanthropist who, without forgetting family or country, lives and dies for mankind or for all creatures. He is the wisest man, the greatest yogin, who not only reaches Brahman by the way of jnana, not only soars to him on the wings of bhakti, but becomes he through God devoted karma, who gives himself utterly for his family and friends, for his country, for all humanity, for the world, yes, and when he can, the solar system and systems upon systems for the whole universe. Can we even imagine this? How can one give to the solar system? See, nowadays this thought has already come. Everything we do has got repercussions all over the universe. And look at, if we really followed this doctrine, how beautiful life and earth would have been. Now we say, yes, yes, we have heard about plastics and the pollution, but doesn't matter. I am unaffected. I have my AC on. This is one kind of thought. But there is another thought which looks at the larger, vaster picture. Sri Aurobindo is asking us to look at the vaster picture in creation. And finally, he reveals, it means that we give up our own petty personal joy and pleasure to bathe up to the eyes in the joys of others, and the joys of one man may be as great as you please. The united joys of 100 must needs be greater. That's why when you go for joy, you see, it's very interesting, everything multiplies. Sorrow you can share, and if there are good people, they will take away your sorrow. But some will multiply. Oh, you had such a bad thing happened with you in life. Don't share sorrows with dukhi atmas. They will start sharing, मेरे साथ भी ऐसा हुआ था. And you end up thinking the whole world is bad. But joy multiplies by sharing, isn't it? Take a walk in the garden. Go to a movie. You feel happier when you share it with someone. So imagine when you share something with this whole creation through the divine. Of course, you can't start doing that outwardly, but inwardly it is possible. So the joy becomes much greater. By renunciation, you can increase your enjoyments 100-fold. If you are a true patriot, you will feel the joys not of one man, but of 300 millions. If you are a true philanthropist, all the joys of the countless millions of the earth will flow through your soul like an ocean of nectar. But you say, their sorrows will flow there too. And look at the answer. That too is an agony of sweetness, which exalts the soul to paradise. How beautiful this is. When you take in the sorrows of this world as Shiva and stain your throat, what happens? That's why Shiva is the most venerated god. Why? Because nobody had the courage to take the sorrow. But he says, I absorb the sorrow of the world. So even that exalts the soul. When you take the sorrows of creation, that too is an agony of sweetness which exalts the soul to paradise, that you can turn into joy, the unparalleled joy of relieving and turning into bliss the woes of the nation for which you sacrifice yourself, or of the humanity in whom you are trying to realize God. Even the mere continuous, patient, resolute effort to do this is a joy unspeakable. Even defeat in such a cause is a stern pleasure when it strengthens the soul for new and ceaseless endeavor. And the souls worthy of the sacrifice derive equal strength from defeat and victory. And then he closes with this wonderful sentence. Remember that it is not the weak in spirit to whom the eternal gives himself totally. If you want to escape the world fight, you can't have the vision on the battlefield of Arjuna. Then you sit in a hermitage and you will have some nice vision. People, I had vision of God. But if you engage with the world play, take the fight, then one day suddenly Arjuna has not tried anything. And Shri Krishna says, come, I'll show you what I have shown to nobody. And he reveals his cosmic form. Why? Because you have engaged. Arjuna has lived like that. His life, Shri Krishna tells him why he has revealed it to him. Arjuna says, who are you? He says, I am giving you this most ancient of yogas, not the first time. What? He says, I gave it to Vivasman, who gave it to Manu, the son, the law of truth, which was given to Manu, the mental thinker, and so on and so forth. So why to me, sir? He says, together we have fought the great battle of the ages. What was that great battle? As Naranarayana. You have always been my instrument. And therefore, I remember it. You don't have to do any yoga. When the time comes, I'll reveal myself to you. Charu Chandra Dutt's story I have several times recounted. How when he was with Sri Aurobindo in the revolutionary period and they used to call Sri Aurobindo chief. And then later on when Sri Aurobindo left on to greater fields, they all got annoyed. To cut a long story short, when Dilip Kumar Roy asked him, do you remember Charu? He said, yes. He is one of those with whom I have fought. We have fought the battle of the ages. Often people say Dilip Kumar Roy had all various defects of nature. Why is it that the Lord showered so much love? And he says, I cherish you as a son and a friend. You know what relation is being declared? When in far back times, during the Iliad, the great Trojan War of which Sri Aurobindo speaks several times, it is said that Paris, the younger brother, was one of the vibhutis of Sri Aurobindo. And who was the elder? He was Hector, the noble scion of Priam family. And he is a real warrior, a hero warrior, who is ready and willing to sacrifice. Now you see, the relation is not just, yoga is something which continues through life. In one life, what we do springs up in another. So he reminds us, remember that it is not the weak in spirit to whom the eternal gives himself wholly. It is the strong, heroic soul that reaches God. So this is what we see in ancient India, the Aryan Dharma. It was not like, okay, I'll go to a pravachan where some Swamiji will come and all the full mala, there'll be some bhajan kirtan. This is much later. If you see Bhishma's Karma Yoga, Raja Janak, these were the ideals. Arjuna, of course, we know, they were the great ones to whom the great knowledge was given. They were worthy because they were not deviating from God's work in the world. And not to people who were sitting in monastery or going for some, give me 10,000 rupees and I'll teach you a method of nirvana. Nirvana doesn't come like that. Even Buddha is a heroic spirit, mighty, who can just abandon everything like that and walk away in search of a perfect solution. That is the heroic soul he is speaking about. Others can only reach his shadow from afar. That too is shadow from afar. In this way, the man who renounces the little he can call his own for the good of others gets in return and can utterly enjoy all that is world in this moving universe. So this is the great practical advice Sri Aurobindo gives. Renunciation is not for becoming morose, suffering, sorrow. This is not renunciation. Renunciation is both logically wise and a strong, only the strong in soul can do it. Because it is not outward renunciation as much as it is inward. Inward is very difficult. Tyaga, not sannyasa. Outward is easy. You go into a monastery, start wearing all white clothes, say, I will not do this, I will not hear that, I will not eat outside. This is elementary. It's required when the soul is very crude. You need it. But as we evolve, we discover that, well, all that I am not doing outside, I am still enjoying inside. And you know the sign of it? Sign is that if I see anybody who is enjoying it, I say, depreciate. Oh, this person, he is a gone case. Why? Because secretly I am enjoying it. If I have truly announced, I will be happy with all the happiness in the world. So this is the big difference. So the heroic spirit, this is what is original Aryan Dharma. Later on we fell because we left this Aryan Dharma, became otherworldly, sannyasa, go into the forest, Muniji who will be sitting somewhere on the river banks. This is our idea of a sage always. Sitting below a tree on some river bank with a dand and kamandalu. Bhiksha patra, bhiksham dehi. No, the heroic spirit is a giver. He is not a beggar of alms. If he has to beg anything, ask anything, he asks the divine. And before he asks, the divine provides for him. And this is the original Sanatana Dharma. And that spirit has to be restored in India. Not this otherworldly. Even now, people talk about all this, but we still hold in our eyes the outer renunciation as something great. The classic example once again of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji. Okay, not Mahatma Gandhi. Excuse me for that. Because the title cannot be given like that, Look at it. I will not fight outside. But I will continue to feel angry inside. This is not renunciation. I will not fight outside, and by my non-doing, I will be the cause of much massacre that is taking place elsewhere. This is not Arya Dharma. Arya Dharma would say injustice, untruth, evil, wherever it is, I will raise my voice and if possible my hands, or if through the pen, but I'll fight because it's untruth, it's falsehood. So this is the difference. But we have placed such people as the ideal. That has been the bane of India. We have forgotten Arjuna, we have forgotten Bhishma, we have forgotten the great renunciate warriors, Rishi Agastya, who gave weapons to Lord Rama, Vishwamitra. They are forgotten in our history. Vasisth, who with his dand could counter the armies of, Vishwamitra. And we have now the ideal is the world shunning ascetic, monk, sannyasi. So let us once again restore Sanatana Dharma to its old pristine glory and live life with that truth, with that realization. Thank you.